Hello, welcome to the Whispered Abyss channel. Happy viewing. Mike Carson adjusted the rear-view mirror, his tired eyes scanning the empty streets. It was nearly 2 a.m., and the city was silent, save for the occasional sound of a distant car. The bus's interior hummed with the soft whir of the engine, casting an eerie glow over the seats. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, making the shadows around him seem a little too alive. But Mike had seen it all before. The loneliness of the late-night shift, the emptiness of the streets, the stillness inside the bus. He had been driving this route for years, and it was always the same. A few stragglers here and there, the tired souls who had missed the last train or just needed a ride to the next stop. But tonight felt different. Something hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like the weight of a storm that hadn't yet broken. With a sigh, Mike pulled away from the curb, the bus's tires squeaking as they met the wet asphalt. The rain had started falling an hour ago, light at first, but now it was coming down in sheets, streaking the windows. It was the kind of rain that made everything outside look like a blur of shadows. He glanced at the clock. 2:10 a.m., another lonely ride. He tapped the steering wheel absent-mindedly as the bus rolled through the empty streets. The radio was off, but there was a faint sound of static in the background, as if it too was waiting for something. That's when the door opened. Mike's eyes flicked up, startled by the sound. He hadn't seen anyone at the stop. It was far too late for anyone to be out here, and the streets were deserted. But there she was, a woman, tall and thin, stepping onto the bus with an air of calm that made Mike uneasy. She was drenched from the rain, her dark hair clinging to her face, but she didn't seem bothered by it. She wore a long coat, her features hidden in the dim light, her gaze fixed on Mike. Without a word, she moved toward the back of the bus and sat down. Mike blinked, momentarily unsure if he'd imagined the whole thing. But there she was, settled in the rear seat, her presence an odd contrast to the silent, empty bus. Last stop for the night, huh? Mike muttered to himself, trying to shake off the chill that had settled over him. He pressed the accelerator, and the bus rumbled forward. The wipers beat rhythmically against the windshield, but the rain only seemed to intensify. The streets stretched ahead, endless and empty. The woman remained silent. Mike's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her pale face, her eyes dark and unreadable. Something about her felt off. He cleared his throat. "Not much for talk, huh?" he said, more to himself than to her. She didn't respond. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on him, unblinking. After a long silence, she spoke. "What is the thing that disappears when you hold it too tightly?" Mike glanced over at her, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. "Excuse me?" "The thing that disappears when you hold it too tightly," she repeated, her voice low but clear. It had a strange, almost melodic quality to it. Mike shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm not much for riddles, lady," he said, trying to brush it off. "You'll have to find someone else for that." She didn't respond. Instead, she stared at him, her eyes piercing through the gloom of the bus. "Time," she finally whispered. "The answer is time." Mike frowned. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He wasn't sure why, but her words sent a shiver down his spine. He glanced at the clock. 2:15 a.m. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but he chalked it up to the loneliness of the shift. It was just another strange passenger. He had dealt with plenty of them before. He returned his focus to the road, but the unease lingered. The rain beat harder against the windows as the bus rumbled down the streets. Mike's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The woman's words had been gnawing at the back of his mind. Time. He couldn't shake the odd feeling that the riddle wasn't just some strange coincidence. The bus slowed as it approached the next stop, and Mike prepared to pull over. But when he glanced in the mirror, he realized something unsettling. There was no one else on the bus. He had seen a few faces earlier in the night, passengers who had gotten off long ago, but now, nothing. He blinked. The woman was still sitting in the rear, but the rest of the seats, normally populated with the occasional late-night rider, were empty. Mike's breath caught in his throat. Had he imagined it? But no. The seats were still damp from the rain, the evidence of people who had been there just moments ago. A chill swept over him. His fingers tightened on the wheel as the headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the darkened streets ahead. But the strange stillness in the bus made it feel like they were the only two people left in the world. The silence stretched on. The woman still hadn't moved, her eyes never leaving him. It was as if she were waiting for something, but Mike didn't know what. Without warning, the bus jolted slightly. Mike's heart skipped a beat as the lights flickered overhead. For a split second, he thought he saw a shadow pass across the seats, but when he looked, there was nothing. "Everything all right, driver?" The woman's voice broke through the silence again, smooth and quiet. Mike swallowed. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thought I saw something." Her lips curled into a faint smile, but it was almost predatory. "You can't trust your eyes," she said cryptically, her gaze still fixed on him. "They see what they want to see." Before Mike could respond, something strange happened. The bus came to a sudden halt. The sound of tires skidding on the wet pavement filled the air, and then silence again. Mike's eyes shot to the front windows. He wasn't sure what had happened. There hadn't been a turn or stop ahead. They had been driving on an empty street. When he looked back, the woman was gone. His heart raced as he scanned the bus. The seat where she had been sitting was now empty, the wet imprint of her coat still lingering on the fabric. Her presence was like a ghost in the air. Mike's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. This wasn't normal. He had been driving buses for over 10 years, and he knew something wasn't right. He had seen plenty of odd things over the years, but this felt different. He exhaled shakily and turned back to the road, but then a thought struck him. Where had she gone? He hadn't heard the door open, hadn't seen her leave. Yet she was gone. Mike slammed his foot on the brake. The bus came to a screeching halt again, sending a wave of tension through his body. He glanced back at the seats, empty save for the woman's coat. It lay there, abandoned, the dark fabric damp from the rain. There was no trace of her. A strange, cold feeling crawled up his spine, the hairs on his neck standing on end. What was happening? Who was she? Why had she come on the bus? And why had she disappeared without a sound? He swallowed hard, his mind racing. But then the answer to the riddle she had given him echoed in his head again. Time. The bus had come to a stop, but Mike felt no relief. His eyes flicked to the clock on the dashboard. 2:25 a.m. Was time slipping away from him too? The question gnawed at him, but he pushed it down, focusing on the road ahead. But as he pressed the gas pedal and the bus lurched forward, he caught sight of something odd in the rearview mirror. The woman's coat, now lying abandoned in the seat, shifted, as though moved by an unseen hand. Mike's pulse quickened. He glanced back at the empty bus. Nothing. just the coat. But his mind raced. Was he going mad, or was something truly wrong? He glanced back at the road, his heart pounding in his chest. Mike's eyes were glued to the rearview mirror, his hands tight on the wheel. His breath came in shallow bursts. The rain continued to beat against the windows, the sound almost deafening now. He had to focus. He had to keep driving. But every fiber of his being screamed to stop, to get off this cursed bus, to run. He glanced at the clock again. 2:30 a.m. Time was passing too quickly, but there was no time to lose. He forced himself to look away from the mirror and back at the road ahead. He couldn't let his mind spiral. The bus continued down the road, past empty streets and darkened buildings. No more passengers appeared. The silence stretched between the rain, an oppressive weight hanging in the air. It was as if the world outside had disappeared, leaving Mike trapped in this lonely, claustrophobic space. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as another thought flashed across his mind. What had she meant by her words? Time disappears when you hold it too tightly. Was that supposed to mean something? Was it a warning? He shook his head, trying to shake off the unsettling thoughts. He had to stay sharp. But the next time he checked the rearview mirror, he saw something that made his heart drop. The empty seat where the woman had been was now filled with a new passenger. Mike's stomach lurched. He hadn't seen anyone get on. The door hadn't opened. How could someone have boarded without him noticing? The new passenger was a man, dressed in a suit, his face pale and drawn. He sat rigidly in the seat, his eyes wide open but unblinking. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and he didn't move. Not a single muscle twitched. Mike's throat went dry as he quickly glanced at the empty seats. He hadn't seen anyone else board. This was impossible. He forced himself to focus. Maybe the man had been there the whole time, hidden in the shadows. Maybe Mike hadn't noticed him before? "Hey," Mike said, his voice shaky. "Are you all right?" The man didn't respond. He sat there, frozen in place. Mike's heart began to race, his breath coming in short gasps. What the hell was going on? The man's pale eyes turned slowly toward Mike. His lips curled into a thin, emotionless smile. "Riddle me this." The man's voice was eerily calm, almost mechanical. "What is the thing that disappears when you try to hold it back?" Mike's blood ran cold. This was too much. This had to be some sort of twisted game. He was starting to lose his grip on reality. He stared at the man. "I'm not playing your games. What do you want?" The man's smile never wavered. "The answer is fear." Before Mike could process what had been said, the lights flickered again, and the bus came to a sudden stop. The screech of tires against wet asphalt was deafening in the stillness of the night. Mike slammed his foot on the brake instinctively, his body jerking forward. When he glanced back at the man in the suit, the seat was once again empty. His pulse raced as he frantically looked around the bus. Where did he go? He hadn't heard the door open. The man had just vanished. Mike's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, his mind spiraling with fear and confusion. First, the woman. Now, this strange man. What was happening? The bus was silent once more. The coat, the riddle, the sudden disappearances. It was all too much. But Mike couldn't escape. There was nowhere to go. He had to finish this ride. But the unease was suffocating. And the riddles? Were they clues? Warnings? As Mike's hands gripped the steering wheel with a white-knuckled grip, he thought of the woman's words again. Time disappears when you hold it too tightly. Maybe it wasn't just time slipping away. Maybe it was something more. something far more dangerous. A cold chill ran down his spine. He was the last passenger now. The rain pounded against the bus like a drumbeat, relentless and unforgiving. Mike's grip on the steering wheel was so tight, his knuckles had gone white. He tried to steady his breathing, but each exhale felt heavier than the last. The empty bus stretched out before him like a tomb, the air thick with tension. He glanced again at the rearview mirror. The empty seat where the man in the suit had been was, once again, vacant. The coat, no longer a coat but a heap of wrinkled fabric, lay still, undisturbed. It wasn't just the disappearing passengers that unnerved him. The way the bus seemed to move, like it was almost alive, like it was pulling him forward, trapping him in its eerie grasp. Mike couldn't explain it, but something felt fundamentally wrong. It felt like the world was folding in on itself, and he was the last person left to witness it. "Focus, Mike," he muttered to himself. "Just get through the night." But even as the words left his lips, he knew it wasn't going to be that easy. Something was out of his control. Something had started, and he couldn't stop it. He glanced at the clock again. 2:45 a.m. Was it possible the hours were slipping away faster than they should? The bus was moving, but it felt as though the time was stuck in a loop. A low buzz filled the air, followed by the flicker of the lights overhead. Mike rubbed his eyes, wondering if he was just exhausted. But when he looked back at the rearview mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the reflection, the woman was there. Sitting in the back again, her eyes locked on his. But she wasn't just sitting. She was smiling. A cold, knowing smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "You're close," she said softly, her voice like a whisper carried on the wind. "But you're not listening." Mike's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts scrambling. Was this really happening? Or was he losing his mind? He glanced back at the empty seats. She was gone. Once again, without a trace. But the feeling remained. Her presence lingered in the very air around him, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. And then a sudden sound, a soft, distant thud, came from the back of the bus. Mike's heart skipped a beat. He slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. He spun around, his eyes scanning the darkened interior. Nothing. His pulse raced as he opened the door to the bus, stepping into the aisle cautiously. The air smelled damp, the scent of rain and something else, something metallic. The darkness seemed to stretch deeper into the corners of the bus. Mike's breath caught as he moved toward the back, the hairs on his neck standing on end. The last seat, the one she had occupied earlier, was empty. But there, lying on the floor, was something strange. A pair of shoes. No, not just shoes. A full set of clothes, neatly folded as if someone had simply stepped out of them. The suit jacket, the pants, the shirt, everything. All laid out in perfect order, as if waiting for someone to claim them. Mike's hand trembled as he reached for them. But as his fingers brushed the fabric, a chill ran through him, like he had touched something alive. The shoes were warm. Not just warm, but hot. Almost burning. Mike jerked his hand back, heart racing. What the hell was going on? Where had the woman gone? And who was leaving clothes behind? He stood frozen for a moment, the strange garments in front of him, the silence pressing down like a heavy weight. The bus seemed to groan as though it were alive, and in that moment, Mike understood. The riddle, the disappearance, the clothes. He wasn't the driver anymore. He was a passenger. He was stuck. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. And just as quickly, the bus lurched forward again, the engine roaring to life, and the world outside seemed to dissolve into an endless sea of rain and darkness. Mike's pulse was hammering in his ears, louder than the rain and the hum of the bus engine. Every part of him screamed to stop, to get off, to run, to escape this nightmare. But the doors wouldn't open. The bus refused to stop. It was as if it had a mind of its own, an unrelenting force guiding him through the storm without an end in sight. He slumped back into the driver's seat, his hands still shaking from the chilling sensation of the clothes. It felt as though the bus was drawing him deeper into something dark and insidious, and no matter how hard he tried to make sense of it, he couldn't. The riddle, the passengers, the disappearing bodies, it all made his head spin. And yet, as the seconds stretched on, Mike realized that the key to his survival lay in understanding the patterns. There was something in the woman's cryptic words, something in the way the man in the suit had disappeared, something in the clothes that were left behind. What was the bus trying to tell him? He glanced down at the dashboard, the faint glow of the lights casting eerie shadows on the control panel. The clock showed 3 a.m., but time felt frozen. It felt as though he was stuck in some kind of twisted limbo. "Focus," Mike muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "You can get out of this." But the deeper he went, the more unsettling it became. The road ahead seemed to stretch into an infinite black void, the streetlights flickering in and out like ghosts. The bus was on autopilot, the only movement coming from the rhythmic swaying as it glided forward. Then a sound, an almost imperceptible shuffle, echoed from the back of the bus. Mike froze. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror. Nothing. But as he looked again, something had changed. The man in the suit was back. He was standing near the back of the bus, his face pale, his eyes wide open. This time, though, he wasn't alone. There was another passenger, a woman, this one older, with wild, unkempt hair and a vacant stare. Mike's heart skipped a beat. He didn't remember seeing them board. The man in the suit smiled again, his grin wide and unsettling. "The journey isn't over, Mike," he said, his voice cold and deliberate. "You're closer than you think. What do you want from me?" Mike's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from the tension building in his chest. The woman stepped forward, her movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached out and touched the back of the driver's seat. Mike's breath hitched. The moment her fingers made contact with the seat, a cold wave of dread washed over him. It was as if something ancient and powerful had just stirred. The bus shuddered, its lights flickering violently before plunging into darkness. When the lights came back on, the woman was gone. But the man in the suit remained, standing eerily still, his eyes locked onto Mike's. "Don't ignore the signs," the man said, his voice dripping with a haunting finality. "The end is near." The hairs on Mike's neck stood on end. He glanced at the clock again. 3:10 a.m. It felt like hours had passed since he last checked, yet the time hadn't moved much at all. Something was wrong. Then there was another jolt. The bus lurched forward, as if it had been given a sudden push. The doors creaked open with a low groan. Mike's heart raced as he stared at the dark street beyond the doors. Was this the final stop? Would he finally escape? Or would he become the next one to disappear? With a mixture of dread and hope, Mike pushed the door open and stepped off the bus. The ground outside was slick with rain, the air thick and heavy, just like the night he'd driven through. He looked back. his breath catching in his throat. The bus was gone. No trace. Not even a puddle of water left behind. But as Mike turned, ready to walk into the unknown, he felt something shift behind him. A figure stood at the edge of the street, its silhouette barely visible in the darkness. The woman, the man in the suit. And then the riddle whispered again, clear as day. Time disappears when you hold it too tightly. Mike froze. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. He hadn't been holding on to time. Time had been holding on to him. And the last passenger was him. Mike's legs shook, as if the ground beneath him had become something less than solid. He looked around, but the street was completely empty. No cars, no pedestrians, not even a stray cat. Just the endless expanse of wet asphalt, stretching far beyond what his eyes could see. The air was thick with mist, like the city was drowning in its own memories. He turned back toward the bus, expecting it to be gone, but to his horror it was still there, parked on the curb as if it had never moved. The lights flickered weakly, the doors ajar, waiting for him to return. But Mike didn't want to go back. He wanted to run, to escape. But his feet were rooted to the spot, his legs stiff with the weight of something he couldn't name. He had to face it, whatever this was, whatever this bus represented. The man in the suit, the woman, the clothes, the riddles, they all led to this moment. They were all part of a twisted game, and Mike was a pawn caught in its web. With a deep breath, he walked toward the bus. Each step felt like it took an eternity, as if the road itself was pushing back against him, trying to stop him from reaching the inevitable. The doors slid open, the low hum of the bus's engine beckoning him inside. He hesitated, glancing back at the empty street once more. The mist had thickened, obscuring everything beyond the bus. "Go," a voice whispered behind him, the woman's voice again, soft yet insistent. Mike stepped inside, the doors closing behind him with a heavy thud. The interior was dimly lit, but something had changed. The seats were full now, all of them occupied by the passengers. Their faces were blank, lifeless, their eyes hollow and vacant. They didn't move. They didn't speak, except for the man in the suit. He stood at the back of the bus, his eyes locked onto Mike's once again. But now there was no smile. His face was expressionless, cold as stone. "You've learned, haven't you?" The man's voice was low, almost a growl. "You understand now." Mike swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "Why is this happening? Why me?" The man in the suit stepped forward, his shoes tapping lightly on the floor. "Because you are the last passenger, Mike. You've always been." Mike's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "You were never driving," the man said. "The bus was driving you. You were never in control." Mike felt his stomach drop. His pulse quickened. He looked around frantically, but the passengers remained silent, unmoving. He had to do something. He had to get off this bus. "Then why did you let me think I was in control?" Mike's voice cracked as he spoke. The man in the suit didn't answer. Instead, he gestured to the passengers, each of them sitting eerily still. "All of these people, Mike. They were passengers, just like you. But they left. And now, you're the last one." The weight of the words hit him like a brick. He understood now. They hadn't disappeared. They'd been chosen. They'd left the bus, but not in the way Mike had thought. They'd become part of it, just like he would. "You're not just a driver," the man continued, his eyes narrowing. "You're part of the journey. The bus needs you, just like you need it." Mike stumbled backward, his back hitting the cold metal wall of the bus. His mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. But when he looked at the passengers, when he really looked, the truth was undeniable. Their faces were distorted, their features twisted in grotesque mockery of humanity. They were part of the bus, just like he was. A sharp, searing pain cut through his chest, as if something inside him had just snapped. He gasped, clutching his shirt, but the pain didn't go away. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, I won't be like them." "You already are," the man in the suit said quietly. "And when the time comes, you'll understand. You'll see." Mike could barely breathe now, the crushing weight of realization pressing down on him. He could feel it, his body, his soul, starting to shift, starting to merge with the bus, becoming part of it. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the pain vanished. The bus rumbled to life again, the wheels turning beneath them, and the world outside disappeared into the darkness. Mike's vision blurred. The streetlights, the rain, the mist, all of it was gone. It was just the bus now. Just him, the man in the suit, and the lifeless passengers. And in that moment, Mike understood the truth. He was no longer the last passenger. He was the next one to disappear. Mike's hands gripped the steering wheel with a vice-like tension, his knuckles pale under the strain. The world outside had faded to black, and the bus was now a solitary vessel sailing through an endless void. The passengers, once a source of confusion and fear, were now nothing more than hollow statues sitting in their seats, their blank stares a constant reminder of what he was becoming. He had tried to fight it. He had tried to understand the riddles, to understand the strange, twisted logic of it all. But the more he tried to break free, the more the bus seemed to pull him in, wrapping him in its inescapable grip. "You're not the first to resist," the man in the suit said from behind him, his voice low and steady, devoid of emotion. Mike could feel his eyes burning into his back. "And you won't be the last." Mike didn't respond. He didn't have the energy to argue anymore. The weight of everything that had happened, the passengers, the disappearance of each one, the strange riddles, the constant feeling of being pulled toward something he couldn't escape, was too much. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Why this bus? Why us?" The man in the suit's eyes gleamed with a dark understanding. He stepped forward, his shoes clicking softly against the floor. "You are here because you were meant to be. The bus has always been here, waiting for the right passengers, for those who are ready to take the journey, and those who are not." The bus lurched again as if it were alive, breathing and shifting with every turn. The road ahead was a black blur, stretching endlessly into the abyss. Mike could feel his heart beating faster, the pressure in his chest building with each passing second. "And the others?" Mike choked out, struggling to breathe. "The ones who disappeared? What happened to them?" The man in the suit paused for a moment, his gaze distant, almost as if he were reflecting on something far older than time itself. "They were taken, just as you will be. But they are not gone. They are part of the bus now, part of the journey, like you will be." Mike's stomach churned. He wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to escape this nightmare. But the words wouldn't come. His body was no longer his own. It was as if the bus had already begun to claim him, to mold him into something else. "You'll be here forever," the man in the suit said, a hint of finality in his voice. "The bus never stops, Mike. It never ends." Mike's vision blurred once again, the edges of his reality slipping away, The passengers in the seats faded in and out of focus, their forms flickering like shadows cast by a dying flame. He could feel himself becoming a part of it, his body, his mind, his very essence fusing with the bus. The woman's riddles, the clothes left behind, the whispers in the darkness. It was all part of the same truth. There was no escape. There was only the journey. And Mike was now bound to it. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his reflection staring back at him. Only it wasn't his face anymore. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale, his expression vacant. He wasn't Mike anymore. Not really. He was just another passenger, another lost soul riding the bus to nowhere. The bus rumbled on, its engine roaring to life as it sped through the endless night. There were no stops. There was no destination. There was only the journey. And as Mike finally understood the full weight of his fate, he let the darkness consume him. Because, in the end, the last passenger was always the one who never left.